Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this Foothold webinar with our wellbeing expert and qualified therapist, Andy Thornton. My name is Jane Petit, and I'm the CEO of Foothold. Just a quick word about what we do. Foothold has a 130-year-long history of supporting engineers and their families. And over that time, we've expanded our support in many ways to focus on wellbeing of engineers and their families, as much as practical help. And this webinar is part of that effort. So today's presentation will be around 45 minutes with time for your questions at the end. So as we go along, if you think of any questions, please post them in the question box at any point in the time, and we will try to cover as many of them as we can, either during the session or at the end. And if your question doesn't get answered, please don't worry. We'll be sending around all the questions and answers afterwards. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Andy Thornton. Andy, tell us a bit about your background and what we'll be talking about today.
Great, thanks Jane, and hi everybody. And thanks for the opportunity to come and talk at this webinar. So I'm Andy Thornton. I'm a qualified cognitive behavioural hypnotherapist. So that's a therapy discipline that fuses together hypnosis and cognitive behavioural therapy. I spent the last 15 years doing training, coaching, development work, and in that period of time took my therapy qualification. And I've supported people from a very broad variety of backgrounds. And at the moment, a lot of my therapy work comes through referral via an occupational health scheme, giving support to people dealing with kind of stress, anxiety, workplace, relationship, bereavement, and so on. I'm a mentor with Warwick University Business School and have been for a number of years. I live in Suffolk with my wife Sam. I've got two boys who are both at university, and I have spent time as a Samaritan on the phones as a listening volunteer for Samaritans. So that's a bit about my background. Today we're going to look at four different areas that are particularly pertinent, I think, at this time of year, and I think they're interrelated. So we got the idea of gift giving, relationships, then we've got loneliness, and all three of those connecting to the broad heading of stress and anxiety. So that's what we'll be covering off.
Thanks, Andy. One of the things that you mention in your blog on the Support Hub is the link between gift giving and happiness. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so gift giving, particularly at this time of year, but also other times, it's a big thing, isn't it? And it's very much front of house for us. It's a tradition. It goes back an awfully long time, covering thousands of years. It's been a hugely important part of our social norms, and not giving gifts can be very problematic. And at all the traditional times of gift giving, we find ourselves under pressure to comply with some of those norms, and a lot of people, certainly some of the people I know, put an enormous amount of effort, time into planning, devising, digging around, shopping, sourcing what is the ideal gift to give to people. Sometimes those are close friends and family, sometimes they're work colleagues, and sometimes they're really people who are probably just acquaintances. And we get so bombarded with suggestions and ideas through media, through advertising, and particularly in today's world through social media, with the suggestions and ideas and indications of what might be a perfect gift. And marketing, the marketing industry and advertising industry at the moment is incredibly sophisticated. It uses a lot of science to influence us in ways that we're probably not consciously aware of, and influence us to buy more for more people and to spend more money, basically. And alongside that, we are surrounded by a huge amount of imagery about people giving and receiving what appears to be the perfect gift, which brings almost instantaneous happiness to the receiver. And a lot of that is very influential in the way that we we set ourselves up and our expectations for how we're going to be or how we need to be. And yet there's some research being done around gift giving, and particularly around Christmas, gift giving and receiving and its relationship to our enjoyment of Christmas and that whole experience. And actually it wasn't found to contribute anything in terms of the overall experience. So there's a strange tension there between something that we put an awful lot of store by and put ourselves under a great deal of pressure to do correctly, to do right. And yet in the grand scheme of the whole celebration of something like Christmas, it doesn't necessarily contribute to our overall enjoyment and doesn't necessarily bring us happiness. So, we have something there which has developed and has a whole industry attached to it, and a big thing in the commercialization of these times. But maybe that's taken us away from the idea of giving as a really symbolic thing, which has genuine meaning and is genuinely indicative of the strength of feeling and the importance we place on relationships and on the people we're giving gifts to or receiving gifts from. Certainly if we get that wrong, I've known some people who will tell a sorry tale of giving the wrong gift to the wrong person, living with the consequences of that, sometimes for considerable periods of time. So reconnecting with that symbolic reason and that true reason of giving gifts as indicative of the value we place on the relationships with the people around us, I think can be much more important and much more closely tied to that idea of happiness, if that makes sense.
No, I think it does. I think it's something that we could all recognise and kind of think, yes, I've been there. So yeah, I think a lot of people will recognise the truth in what you've been saying.
Yeah, and I think that's just in the normal run of things. And I think in this year, particularly 2020, what an exceptional period of time this year has been certainly for me. And I don't think there are many people alive who will have known anything quite as extraordinary as the last kind of 7, 8, 9 months. And I think that brings with it its own set of pressures around the idea of gift giving, because I think there are certainly some indications of a great increasing pressure or desire on people to make something really special of this moment, and we see it in some of the conversations that are going on in the media at the moment around, opening up society to allow it to happen. And I think that potentially brings a greater desire to make this so special, and therefore to do that we've got to buy that extra gift or spend a bit more money or get something slightly bigger, because there's something about this year that we just want to go, yeah, we're on the way out of it, and to make ourselves feel better, and sometimes whether we can afford that or not. So I think there's an extra additive danger that 2020 will bring more discomfort to more people, albeit the intentions behind gift giving are sound and they're good. There are things that we can do. I think we can really stop and look at what are we doing, and what are we giving, and why are we giving a gift to somebody? What's the true meaning behind it? And really reconnecting with that in a very honest way. So it's not just a commercial exercise that we're going through, but it's something that we genuinely feel and we want to do. And I think if you could put real meaning behind the gift, then it doesn't have to be something purchased. It can be something that has cost nothing but has some real symbolism and some real meaning behind it. And I think that counts for a lot. And perhaps people will be very open to that, very receptive to that in this year. I don't think we have to get sucked in to the whirlpool of keeping up with the Joneses, doing what everybody else has to do. Whatever somebody else spends, we have to do the same thing or match in size or value of gift. I think that's a trap that many advertisers would have us fall into. And hand on heart, I think I've probably fallen into it in my time. But it certainly doesn't help, and it doesn't bring happiness, because it tends to be a relatively shallow offering. And I think at another level, I think there's a lot of talk about the environment, the planet, and the ecology of what we're doing. And for many of us, the last thing we need is more stuff. Actually, we need probably less stuff. And so gifts, we've certainly had the conversation in this household, do we want to do that? We try so hard to buy things for people who fundamentally don't need anything. And the one thing we've got that is perhaps the most precious of all is time. That one resource that we have, which is scarce. We have a lot of pressures on our time, and we can't get it back once it's gone. And maybe the one thing and the ultimate gift we can give somebody, and particularly this year, is actually a bit of our time. So I think that that's a kind of whistle stop of some of the issues around gift giving.
And that kind of came quite nicely into the next thought around pressures on relationships at this time of year, whether caused by a bad gift, or if you think there's been lots of TV shows and potentially films. I mean, Four Christmases is one that comes to mind, which also has a scene about buying gifts that are completely out of kilter with the ones that somebody else has got you. And they all take quite of a comedic view into being pressured into spending time with people who maybe we would normally not choose to be with. And I know that's something that you've also covered in the blog.
Yeah, I think it's a big one, really, relationships. Again, we are social creatures, aren't we? Human beings are social creatures. We like to connect. We like to be with and around other people. We build our societies based upon people working together and cooperating for mutual benefit. And in our working lives, that they revolve around building and maintaining effective relationships with people. And even in situations where those people, we would never count them as friends necessarily, but colleagues, and we can have very good working relationships with people in that way. And yet here we are at a time of year where you think relationships would bring us the most joy and happiness, and that's not always the case, is it? Because in the normal run of things, we can typically choose what we do with relationships. We might not be able to choose all of our colleagues, but we have a great deal of latitude about the degree to which we engage, the amount of ourselves, I suppose, we put into those relationships, and the extent to which we keep them as strictly professional, or whether we let them drift into more friendship-based relationships. So while we can't control all aspects of it, we do have a great deal of control over some of it for most of the time. But then, at other times, and at times like this, times of great celebration, when society and the traditions and norms of society bring us together, actually we don't necessarily have that same freedom to choose who we're mixing with and the extent to which we're mixing. So and it's not just Christmas. There are other religious or family-based events that draw us together, and it is a social pressure to conform. And we've all heard, I'm sure, about family arguments that have been driven by, whose family do we go to? Do we have to go to anybody's family? Do we have to try and see everybody over a period of 3 days? And how do we do that? And it's quite difficult actually to say no to some of those pressures, because we feel a kind of social obligation, because these people are relatives and family, and or people we perhaps haven't seen for a while. So we often find ourselves spending time, and often too much time and too little space. A lot of people pushed together into a space that probably isn't quite set up for that number of people, and those people who wouldn't necessarily normally be our first choice to spend time with. So yes, we've got the kind of pressure cooker bit of bringing the right gift with us and getting the gift giving right, and then being put in a social space, physically and relationship based, which is perhaps where often, if we were brutally honest with ourselves, we would not choose to be. But we feel that we ought to. And so, we're again faced with this contradiction of of a time of the year which is presented to us as full of happiness and joy and goodwill and everybody having a great time, and yet we can find ourselves feeling quite stressed and unhappy in that time. So for many of us, this is a kind of a bit of a melting pot, a mixing pot of stress and anxiety and pressures that we're confronted with, and it can start from the whole run up to the period we're in now, and of course the run up to things like Christmas starts earlier every year. At one point, it's bound to catch up with itself, isn't it? So it starts earlier every year, and that kind of mental pressure that we put on ourselves about getting it right, about sorting out, about not disappointing anybody, about making this a really good event, and we've got to get on with everybody, and maybe ruminating then over some of the things that have gone on before when previous years haven't gone according to plan, and why didn't we do that? And so we kind of end up in a period of time in those social spaces with those people around us, and a kind of series of stress, tense, terse exchanges, muttered grumblings that really add to that whole pressure cooker effect of just too many people trying to fit into too small a space, when one or more of them maybe don't really want to be there, but feel that they ought to. And I think relationships can be complicated enough in the normal run of things, but when you've got that extra dimension of feeling coerced, then you get this increased pressure and negativity and that negative energy. And I think in the blog I termed it a sense of a sort of social claustrophobia that you feel, because you actually get that sense of being trapped with no way out, and a claustrophobic feeling in those difficult relationship spaces. And of course that triggers all the stresses in us. It triggers the fight or flight response, and that moves us into a space which can be very difficult to deal with at all times, really. And then of course we start to feel more isolated and worse, because we haven't achieved that idealized wonderful family event where everybody's happy, which is the Disney image, if you like, of what Christmas actually should be like, which of course isn't necessarily terribly realistic. And those feelings that we end up with as very negative, and that negative energy can easily flow on way beyond the event itself and carry forward and affect our relationships and our feelings towards those people around us for ages afterwards, into months and years if we're not careful. So how do we deal with that? How do we make some of that a little bit easier? Well, I think the first one is whatever space you're in, find some time to take for yourself. Actually stepping away to a quiet space, even if it's only for 5 or 10 minutes, can make all the difference. I read recently that something like 70% of the population are actually introverts, which is quite an interesting statistic, really. And so, the vast majority of people we come across are likely to be introverts. And as an introvert, actually recharge time is really important. The time when you step away from that human connection and go and sit quietly and kind of charge the batteries back up is really important. So finding that ability to step away and get quiet space can be really, really helpful. And there's lots of stuff referenced around mental health about getting outside, and that's a classic, to just get outside if you can. Even if everybody goes, inevitably there's more space. You can kind of walk along in your own quiet, in your bubble for a period of time, and lots of documented evidence of the beneficial effects of getting outside, and allowing yourself to just reset and recharge those difficult spaces. In the run-up to events like this, don't put yourself under too much pressure. Don't build that expectation that it's going to be perfect, that everybody's going to get on, that it's all going to be happy families all of the way through, because actually we're all human. You know, we have ups and downs and good times and bad times, and it's a lot more sensible to allow that and accept it than to try and fight it, because it just sets ourselves up for failure. And then, of course, the other one is to make a point of just checking in with the people around you, being aware of the people around you, and perhaps being aware that you might be having a great time, and you might feel great, but somebody else around you in the room might be feeling a little bit uncomfortable. And so can we bring empathy and compassion into our relationship with others and recognize that actually some other people periodically might need to step away as well, and they might just need a quiet word to recognize that and appreciate it, to give them permission to do it, and that can make all the difference, you know. And then lastly, I would say just keep it in perspective. You know, nothing lasts forever, and these periods of time, these events, be it Christmas or other events, in the grand scheme of life, they're relatively short, and so, you know, nothing lasts forever, and you're going to come out of this in a relatively short period of time, and you can go back to normal life where you've got a little bit more control over those relationships that you enjoy. So yeah, that's a bit of relationships. It can be a very fraught time in the midst of all the fun and games and enjoyment.
And I think that point about, you know, checking in with the people around you is really good, because I suppose the other side, the other flip side of that is that there are people who maybe even in that crowd are facing feelings of loneliness. And I suppose, how can they best help themselves during times like this?
Well, yeah, I think loneliness is a significant issue, generally. And I think if we're honest, you know, we're certainly all familiar with the word, and I guess probably most of us at some point will have experienced a feeling of loneliness at some time. But fortunately for most of us, it's probably something that isn't major. It's not massively significant. It's something probably relatively short-lived, and that we come through relatively quickly and probably relatively unscathed. But of course, for others, loneliness is and can be a chronic condition. You know, it can have some really severely negative effects. And I think at this time of year, particularly when we are bombarded with so many images of people in these, you know, family settings, I'm going to say the word party, and of course that feels completely wrong with the current restrictions that are on. But actually, in those party, those celebratory groups that we see, and they're smiling and they're laughing and apparently having these kind of really joyful experiences, and they're close and they're with all their loved ones. And you know, and in a normal year, that's okay. It's good for the people who can get it, and can be quite difficult for people who haven't got access to that. But I think particularly this year, you know, actually loneliness is particularly challenging this year, because just from things that have come out in the press and through the lockdowns, you know, lockdown has for some people greatly exacerbated those feelings of isolation and loneliness. So in a way, that their defences are already down. You know, they've already had a really difficult time of it over an extended period of time, and then to be confronted with the imagery and this idea of other people enjoying it, I think that makes for a particularly difficult recipe. You know, and I know from my time when I was a Samaritan, a lot of the calls we took as a Samaritan were people who were fundamentally lonely, you know, and struggling and just wanted a bit of human connection. So I think, you know, and there are ways of which you can think about it. So there's the obvious one where you see somebody who is on their own, simply on their own. But of course, that's not the be all and end all of it. And people can be on their own and absolutely not lonely, be quite happy and content in their own space. So there are other people who can be in the midst of a crowd or in the midst of a family gathering and actually feel that intense loneliness. And some of the signs of that we can look for, you know, and be aware of, is that just general inability to connect with other people. to build that connection. It goes back to relationships, probably that ability to connect and have a social connection. And some of those feelings can be really overwhelming, and even if you're with other people, that isolation, it can be completely overwhelming. And of course, other people can appear to be the life and soul of the party. They can put on the mask of sociability and fun and engagement, and actually still under all of that fundamentally be feeling extremely lonely. So I think that can be a challenge. And some of the impacts on loneliness that have been shown are general effects on health, well-being, on mental health, creating increased levels of the stress hormone cortisol, and the health impacts of that, on weight, difficulty sleeping, on mental health, and of course can lead into things like depression, and much more serious illnesses, really. So I think that can be particularly challenging for people, and so if you experience it, if you're feeling those feelings of loneliness, that can be a really difficult thing to deal with. And I think this year, as I said, particularly this year, that opens up some considerable challenges, but just generally it does as well. And I think the important thing for somebody who is experiencing any of that is to reach out to people, to look for help. I think there is help out there. The organisations such as Foothold, you have signposting to different groups and organisations, and nearly every local area will have groups and charities that are set up and they're established to help with people who are experiencing loneliness, whether that's a befriending service or some other service that is available. So I know it can take some courage to break that cycle, and particularly if you're deep into it. But actually having made the first step and reaching out and looking for those support groups that are there, there's more out there than you think. And there are always groups like the Samaritans, 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year are available for somebody who needs to talk. And so I think they're incredibly valuable, and that they provide an extraordinary service to people in need. So never hesitate to reach out and seek help. And if you do have friends and family, don't be ashamed of saying, I'm struggling. And it's one of the great tragedies of our time that people find it so difficult to articulate mental and emotional difficulties. We wouldn't hesitate to talk about having the flu. That's perfectly normal for us to talk about in modern society. But anything connected with emotional health, it's improving, but we're not there yet. There's still too much of a taboo. It's still too difficult for people to talk about it. So I think being able to open up about it and talk about it, I think is really useful. If you're in a really low space, one of the things that can help is specifically scheduling and arranging for yourself to do something that will make you feel good. It's a proven mood enhancer. It won't necessarily address those feelings of loneliness per se, but actually anything that can lift that low mood and give you a feeling of achievement, a feeling of satisfaction, can start to break the negative mental cycle. And so it only has to be a few minutes of pleasure, but just something that you can specifically and consciously recognize as an achievement can be very good. And any small step that's a positive one is a good step to take, because it makes the next step after that so much easier, and the one after that so much easier again. And of course, as we said a few minutes ago, anything mood related, getting outside, getting into the open air, going for a walk, taking some exercise, those are all good things to do to help lift mood. And reiterating again this idea about being aware of the people around you. So even if you don't feel lonely, loneliness is often invisible. You know, we don't necessarily see it. So being aware of the people around you, being conscious of them, might be friends, might be neighbours, might be family members, but really tuning in to those people around you and going, well, you know, are they okay? Might they be experiencing and feeling loneliness at this time of year and on the back of everything that we've gone through in 2020? You know, and actually, again, don't hesitate to reach out. You know, a call, a knock on the door, a text message, an email can make all of the difference, because you just make that human-to-human connection. And, you know, what could be a very small gesture for you can have a massive impact for the person who receives that. And so I would really encourage people to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting how much just a little change, how much of a difference it can make, and as you say, make taking that next step so much easier. I mean,
Yeah.
I think a lot of what we've been talking about today can lead to feelings of stress and or anxiety, and I think that's something else that you've talked about in your blog.
Yeah, I think if you take the other topics together, you know, actually the negative effects of any one of those areas, you know, the net consequence of that is likely to be an increase in stress and anxiety and the pressure that we're feeling. And of course, you know, stress in some level is perfectly normal to us as human beings. We all get stressed from time to time. It's a normal part of daily life. And actually, to some degree, we wouldn't want to be without it. You know, you wouldn't want to be so laid back that nothing matters. So a little bit of stress in life is actually not a bad thing. But of course, when those feelings of stress and anxiety build up, then they can start to become overwhelming, and they bring with them an enormous amount of emotional distress. You know, and you know, it's not really surprising that significant life events can bring increased levels of stress and anxiety. You know, what are they, moving house is a huge stressor. Changes of job are stressors. Getting married, those sort of things. You know, they're big things where we face a lot of personal responsibility and can bring a lot of stress and anxiety to us. And of course, if you lose your job, and we know that a lot of people through the course of this year will have gone through that kind of experience, you know, that is in itself a huge stressor. And often, you know, we'll find stress levels are building up gradually over time. So we get a sort of an accumulation of stress, which is coming from a range of different situations. And then certainly with some of the people I work with, you know, that they are surprised when eventually that stress bubbles over and has got to a point where it's unmanageable. And it's not triggered by a single event. It kind of gets to be the straw, the final straw that breaks the camel's back, really. But actually, it's an accumulation of stresses over a period of time, and that's particularly relevant for this year, because of course, you know, we've had all the normal, usual stresses that we experience in life from any of those life events or any others, and then we've had the pandemic, which kicked in kind of February, March time, and we went into first lockdown. So that's an immediate change on lifestyle, what we were able to do, our relationship to work, our relationship to colleagues, our relationship to society and the communities in which we live. So that immediately started to increment, and so everybody has been dealing with a range of stresses and tensions that will have had an effect. And so it's kind of reasonable to expect that now, you know, we're going into the darker months of the year. You know, we've got that winter period of time. We've got shorter days. We've got less daylight. There's really recent reports about, you know, lowered levels of vitamin D and the effect that has on people's health and well-being because we haven't got the daylight. And then we've got the festive season, you know, and all the things we've been talking about so far that come together. And that brings its own stresses normally. So we pile all that into the mix and add it on top of everything else. And it's not surprising that, you know, a number of people are going to find things particularly difficult and challenging this year. And I think that was, you know, we are going to get that, and it's to be expected. And
interestingly, we've got a question here from Srija, who's saying pressure can often come from managing boundaries with people that we're close to. What would you recommend for helping figure out and enforce our own boundaries in a healthy way?
oh, wow, what a great question. Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. So those boundaries with people that we're close to or supposed to be close to. I mean, I suppose the first thing I say is know what your boundaries are. You know, I think we're not always necessarily aware of those boundaries until they've been crossed. So you know, be aware of your boundaries and what your needs are. I think it's very easy to get pulled into a feeling of obligation that we have to satisfy somebody else's needs, and somebody who might have very different boundaries to us and very different demands. And actually we become subservient to that. And actually I've talked to many people over the years who have effectively factored themselves out of those kind of equations. They don't think about themselves at all. It all becomes about the other person and meeting the needs of the other person, and completely at the expense of ourselves. And I would say, don't be afraid to put yourself back into the mix. And you know, your needs are as valid as anybody else's. You know, treat yourself as an equal in that equation, and don't be afraid to say, I need a bit of space. You know, and if you can't do that absolutely in the moment, then make a point of when you can come away from that relationship or that connection, then step away, take the breathing space, go and find somewhere quiet to rebalance yourself. You know, so I hope that helps to answer it a little bit.
Thank you.
Feel free to follow if that hasn't satisfactorily. But certainly put yourself in the mix and don't be afraid to, you know, it doesn't have to be an aggressive thing. It just to be, you know, this is what I need, and that's perfectly valid. Don't forget that.
So we were talking about, you know, kind of how you manage those stresses and pressures and what we can do to help. And, you know, I hope that that's kind of helped Srija in thinking about how she can put herself, as you say, into the mix and reduce some of that pressure. What else can we do to help that stress and anxiety?
Well, I mean, the thing that I think is really important to recognise is particularly when we're talking about anxiety. Anxiety is future-based. So anxiety is a worry about something that might happen in the future. It is not present-based, and it's something that hasn't happened yet. So we create an awful lot of suffering for ourselves because we live in a world that actually is fundamentally imagined. It's not real. So we experience the difficulty and suffering in very real ways, but the thing we're worrying and anxious about isn't real because it hasn't happened. We're worried about it happening. So we're worried about what might happen. We're worried about something going terribly wrong over the festive period. We're worried about upsetting somebody, but we haven't done it yet. So actually a lot of it is future-based. And so we are very good at projecting forwards as human beings. That's something we do extremely well, and we do it very naturally. And interestingly, what we will typically do is project forward in the negative. Now there is a school of thought that comes out of evolutionary psychology that suggests the reason we do that is because, in an evolutionary sense, that tendency has kept us alive. So if we project the negative in evolutionary terms, we're more likely to stay alive. Now, in modern social terms, that's not necessarily very helpful. So there's a, you know, in sense of evolutionary psychology, it's designed to do us good. The trouble is, it doesn't do us a lot of good in today's world. So that's not quite so useful. And being aware of that and being aware of the future focus of anxiety can be very helpful. Because if you can recognize it, you can come back and go, well, actually, what's going on right now? What's going on right in front of me? Because it probably isn't the thing you're anxious about, if that makes sense. And stress and discomfort will typically come about because we find ourselves in a situation that we don't want. We're in a space and situation that we want to be different, but it isn't different. Now, obviously, if we can change the situation we're in, so if we can walk away, if we can leave, if we can go somewhere else, then that's great, because that's what we can do, and we can deal with that stress and discomfort simply by absenting ourselves from that space. But as we've said earlier, a lot of the time at the moment, we've got social pressures, family pressures that suggest it can be quite difficult to do that. So recognizing that that's what's going on, we're in a space, we're in a situation, we don't want to be in that situation, but we can't change the situation. Then actually the danger is we lock ourselves into a sort of mental cycle of we experience a problem, we trigger the stress hormones, and we trigger the older part of our brain, which is to do with threat. We start to look for a solution to that problem, which we can't find because we can't change the situation. And so we end up with a negative feedback loop that goes round and round and round and gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and to the point where it starts to become overwhelming to us. And once we've done that, it's much more difficult to think about and deal with the situation and the issues in a calm and a rational way. And so one of the things that we can do is start to accept the situation we're in and to not fight it. If we can't change it, don't fight it. We can definitely say that we can accept the way we're feeling. And it ties back to the question, the last question. We can be clear about the way we're feeling, that we're feeling uncomfortable, and it's the classic, it's okay to not be okay kind of phrase, and to allow that to be all right for yourself in your own head. Because if you start to argue with yourself about the fact you're not feeling great, then in a way you go, no, I don't feel great, and now I feel bad because I'm not feeling great. And again, that just adds more pressure into the mix, and that loop where you have this internal argument, an internal wrestling match with yourself, because you shouldn't be feeling like this. So you end up feeling bad about feeling bad, and then you're annoyed with yourself because you're feeling bad about feeling bad, and so it goes on and on and on and gets worse and worse. So accepting the feelings and accepting the situation that's right in front of you actually can be really, really effective and surprisingly easy to do. The minute you let go of the fight and relax into your situation, then a lot of those stresses drop away. And when the stresses drop away, your mental activity shifts, and you allow the more rational part of your brain to become active again, and that opens up options and space for you to do something differently. So it starts to quell that automatic, instinctive response, which is in the fight or flight arena. In support of that, mindfulness has been shown to be incredibly effective at helping. Over properly practiced mindfulness will alter the way the brain works, the way it functions. It's well evidenced that it's highly effective. But a mindfulness approach is very, very useful at those times of stress, because it brings you to calm, non-judgmental, present moment awareness. And that's enormously valuable at times like this. There are very good breathing techniques available to help to calm the stress responses in the body and to activate the body's own kind of balancing mechanism, if you like. And there's lots of useful online resources, apps and things that are available to give people exercises that can be really helpful in that space. So there's lots of stuff available online to support that sort of area. And the last thing that I think I found to be very useful and encouraging people to do is actually to write down those thoughts and feelings that they're experiencing. The act of writing something down, and particularly if you write it, on a pen, with a pen and paper, there is something about the act of writing, physically writing something, it's almost like the transfer of thoughts out of your head, down your arm, through the pen and onto the paper, which is very, very therapeutic. At the very least, it changes the perspective. You can look at those thoughts and you can look at what you've written about the thoughts and the feelings that you're experiencing, and you see them in a different way because actually they're in front of you and not in your head. And that can be extremely effective at helping people and then move away from and let go of some of the stress and the anxiety and the tension that they've been experiencing. So there's a lot of support online, a lot of help online for things like that. You know, and there's a lot of people around who can support as well. And the one thing I would say, just in conclusion, although stress and pressure and anxiety can feel overwhelming, I know from a number of the people I work with, it can be surprisingly quick to shift the way you're feeling at any moment in time. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Somebody was just asking if we can give a link to some breathing exercises online, and we will do that in the follow-up. And we'll send some links out for people to help them find the right spaces. There are some really good ones out there, as you say. I mean, yeah, Andy, thank you so much for all that advice and ideas. And I hope that for everybody who's joined us, you found some of that useful. You found something that resonated with you, that you might find helps the Christmas season a little bit more. Thank you so much for taking time to spend with us. We have really appreciated your time. And as we've always, we're looking at ways to expand and improve our support. So if you could please take 30 seconds at the end of this, just to fill in a short survey that pops up. And in the meantime, if there's anything that we can help you with, well-being related, finance, career, anything, please head to myfoothold.org and get in touch with us via the contact us page, and we'll be back to you within 2 working days. So have a wonderful evening and a peaceful holiday season, and we'll see you next year.
Thanks.
Thank you.